right, good evening, everybody. Pleased to be here. I wish I was there in person, but maybe next time. So the title of my talk is I am one of the Concourse. And let me just try to do this thing. All right. So I'm one of a Concourse, interpreting Aleister Crowley's The Heart of the Master as a Thelemic apocalypse. The British poet and writer on esoteric subjects, Aleister Crowley, is famous or infamous for a variety of reasons, but those who take him seriously tend to accept his claim to be the founder of a new religious movement known as Thelema. Thelema is a Greek word, and its intended English translation is as well. The formal inception of the Thelemic movement took place in the year 1904, in the month of April, 8th, 9th, and 10th of April, when Crowley, according to his consistent claim and account, took down as a scribe in the city of Cairo the 3 chapters of its foundational document or scripture, the Book of the Law. The author of the text dictated to Crowley, according to the latter, was a discarnate, preterhuman spiritual entity that called himself I was, and who declared himself to be a messenger, etymologically angel, of the god of silence, Harpocrates. Harpocrates means child Horus, which is significant because, as Crowley came to argue, the reception of the Book of the Law signaled the beginning of the Aeon of Horus, also known as the Aeon of the Child. The book of the Law, proclaims the abolition of the previous moral codes and introduces its own fundamental axiom, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Superficially declaring the chaotic anarchy based on the precept of doing whatever one wants, the law of Thelema, Crowley was adamant, meant exactly the opposite. It called for the discovery and utter faithfulness to the execution of one's purpose on earth, one's will, and the renunciation of everything else, unless subservient to this primary and exclusive goal. As he put it succinctly, and I quote, thou must, 1, find out what is thy will, 2, do that will with A, one-pointedness, B, detachment, C, peace, end quote. Crowley considered the pursuit of magic and mysticism, what he called magic, with K at the end, as the best means of discovering one's will. Influenced by James Fraser, who studied the golden bough he greatly admired, Crowley tended to regard magic as closer to science and as different from religion. And there still remains a certain resistance among a segment of the adherents of Thelema against the notion that this system is in fact a form of religion. Some prefer to call it philosophy, or a way of life, or a system of magic, and a school of esotericism, rather than a religious dispensation. And while it is not a scholar's business to define to people what is the nature of what they do and think and believe, from the perspective of religious studies as such, there is no doubt that Thelema qualifies as a religion. It has its scripture, its prophet, its pantheon, its ritual, calendar feasts, and so on and so forth. It is not my intention to dwell on this, but on this particular issue, except to make a related suggestion that the corpus of Thelemic literature, as penned by Crowley, aside from received, commentarial, and expository writings, contains also several texts that could be reasonably considered as examples of relatively contemporary apocalypses, a literary genre I will be focusing on in due time. Leaving aside the Book of the Law, which does contain apocalyptic aspects, both in its formal structure and in the identity of some of its dramatis personae, the beast and the scarlet woman with their roots in the Book of Revelation, the 2 principal texts of this kind are the Vision and the Voice and the Heart of the Master. I intend to devote a future work to an explication of the religious and apocalyptic content of the Vision and the Voice, which is a text of extraordinary complexity. For the present purposes, my focus will be on the Heart of the Master. The Heart of the Master was originally published in German translation in the journal Pan Sophia in 1925. There are several reasons for choosing this work as a subject of interpretation, but the primary one is that it encapsulates the religious, philosophical, and ethical principles of Thelema in a manner that is both comprehensive and succinct. If a person was to read only one of Crowley's works in order to gain a general insight into his ideological and spiritual position, the Heart of the Master would serve the purpose admirably. I also propose to treat the text as an example of a Thelemic apocalypse, with an underlying assumption that reading it through such lenses will add further to its comprehension. Next section is the Heart of the Master, summary and a brief analysis of the text. The Heart of the Master is divided into three sections: the vision, the voice, and the temple of truth. I will focus and comment briefly on each of these sections in turn. An immediate observation should be made concerning the pen name employed by the authorial persona, Khaled Khan. While it is not unusual for Crowley to use pseudonyms, Khaled Khan is exceptional in being employed only in the Heart of the Master and nowhere else in Crowley's writings. Khaled Khan is also the narrator of the text, in which he is placed in a position of a disciple of the instigator of the tremendous spiritual revolution that the text describes, and who is identified only one by name in the narrative as Master Therion, i.e. Crowley. Stated simply, Crowley is described in his role of the prophet of Thelema as an agent referred to by the third-person pronoun, separate from the first-person pronoun narrator of the text. This choice of the authorial voice suggests Crowley's intention to present the contents of the narrative as objective events taking place beyond the confines of his own subjectivity. The first section of the text, the vision, introduces the narrator as one of the Concourse. The scene is a battlefield where some sort of enormous cataclysm has taken place, and where the majority of those present seem falling into lethargy. The narrator describes his predicament with a subtle reference to the hopeless condition of a candidate before initiation. I quote, "I know not who I am, I know not whence I came, I know not whither I go," end quote. He gradually remembers that he is a soldier engaged in some lost war, and that he nevertheless needs to press forward. Everything is enveloped in darkness, also described as the 0 hour. A voice of a captain draws attention to the star in the west, which provokes mocking comments coming from the other voices in the dark. After a period of utter confusion and horror, experienced and expressed vividly by those witnessing these events, a vision emerges of a solitary human figure on top of a pyramidal mountain in the west. The narrator understands that this was, I quote, "he for whom we all so long had waited," end quote. The person in question is described as robed and adorned as a religious figure wearing a ceremonial dress. He is surrounded by 4 creatures, which are based on the representations of the 4 cherubim, given with a slight variation as lion, eagle, buffalo cow, and babe. They each proclaim certain descriptive attributes of the Master. Finally, a 5th creature emerges from a wheel above the human figure's head. This is a serpent with the head of a sphinx, which touches the mouth of the Master, who then proclaims in a song, "The word of the law is Thelema." At this, the whole sky is, and I quote, "aflame with a great blast of trumpets, and the world is alight with one flash, that sundered every spirit that liveth, branding this sign upon them, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," end quote. Now 7 birds emerge, and each declares pertinent characteristics of the Master. Every such statement is preceded by a proclamation of one word. These words are otherwise known as magical formulae. This all culminates in a passion of great peace, followed by silence. The narrator experiences ecstasy of mystical union where, I quote, "there is nothing separate anymore at all, wherefore the vision faileth, the seer being one with the seeing," end quote. The second section of the Heart of the Master, the voice, in effect translates the silence occasioned by the mystical union previously described. It is remarked at the outset that the sevenfold purging is required before one can dwell in the sanctuary of the Heart of the Master. As consistent with Crowley's penchant to employ as a conceptual framework the occultist version of the kabbalistic tree of life, with 10 sephirot represented by circles and associated with numbers, and 22 paths associated with Hebrew letters. And in this occasion, as it concerns the stages of spiritual development, the sevenfold purging refers to the ascent along the 7 lower sephirot on the tree. These 7 sephirot correspond to the manifest phenomenal universe. They are also associated, among other things, with the planets of classical astrology. To go beyond them, to reach the sanctuary of the Heart of the Master, requires one to cross the abyss. In Crowley's esoteric worldview, as partially inherited from the teachings of the Hermetic order of the Golden Dawn, crossing the abyss that separates the nominal from phenomenal existence is characterized by the transcendence of one's ego, as well as of dualistic cognitive predispositions. This state can only be alluded to by a paradox or by silence. In this section of the text, the supra-abysmal silence is translated into segments that inform the cosmological, philosophical, ethical, and magical religious points of view that characterize the new Aeon and the Law of Thelema. The numerological and kabbalistical basis of these segments, each of which consists of short statements in poetry or prose or both, are as follows. The 10 sephirot on the tree are represented by the 10 secret joys of the Master. The 22 paths on the tree are addressed by the 22 secret instructions of the Master. The fourfold division of the universe, often symbolized by the 4 traditional elements, or the so-called 4 worlds of Kabbalah, is here referred to by the section on the 4 virtues of the Heart of the Master. And finally, the sevenfold division, already alluded to with reference to the required purgings, is described in a poem, Carmen, in which typical virtues associated with the 7 lower sephirot are brought into correlation with the enlightened qualities of the Master. The penultimate statement preceding the Carmen is concerned with the symbolic depiction of the binary and mutually complementary nature of reality, which is here denoted by the pairing between the god Pan and the nymph Syrinx. The third and final section of the text is called the Temple of Truth. It consists of 2 segments. The longer one is entitled Initiation, while the other concerns the mystery of sin. Similar to the opening section of the text, it contains more formal narrative elements. We are told that Khalid Khan received an initiation somewhere in Tunisia in a secret place called the Temple of Truth. That is, I quote, cut from the living rock of the middle point of the summit of a high mountain, end quote. He is brought to this place at midnight and encounters an old man, aged 120 years, who stands before a 7-fold table with fire, incense, and bread on it. This segment is loosely modeled on the legend of Christian Rosenkreuz, whose tomb was supposedly discovered 120 years after his passing and whose body was found in a heptagonal chamber. The old man anoints Khalid Khan's eyes, ears, and lips, which results in his seeing an image of a god with a sickle and an hourglass, obviously denoting the god Saturn. The reference to Saturn is important because it suggests that this initiation takes place above the abyss, and Saturn corresponds with the Sephira Bina on the Tree of Life, the only classical planet that is found above the abyss. The god reverses the hourglass, and the last grain of sand falls through, suggesting the end of time, with the implication that this refers to the end of the previous Aeon. The old man then points out a parchment that carries an emblem of the AA. The AA, known only by its initials, is one of the two magical fraternities that Crowley was deeply involved with, the other being the OTO. In Crowley's system, the designation AA has a twofold meaning. It can refer to this esoteric order in general, or more specifically, it denotes the so-called Supreme College that exists above the abyss. Those who belong to this highest division are sometimes described as the Great White Brotherhood, somewhat resembling the theosophical notion of Mahatmas, whose task is to direct the spiritual progress of humanity. Khaled Khan learns that the Brotherhood sends the emissaries every 2,000 years, bringing one word to serve mankind as a new formula of magic, that it may take one further step on the long road that leadeth to perfection. It is further declared that within a 2,000-year period, the lesser prophets are also sent in the intervals of little more than 3 and a little less than 7 centuries to prepare the way for the next word or to restore the virtues of the current one. The names of the emissaries sent to various civilizations and historical epochs follow, and while some were eligible to Khaled Khan, what he was able to read in the scroll were these: Fu Shi, credited with the development of the I Ching system; Lao Tzu, the founder of Taoism; Gautama, the Buddha, founder of Buddhism; Zerdusht, better known as Zarathustra, Iranian prophet; Pythagoras, Dionysus, and Osiris. Finally, the reference to the current prophet is made. His name is not revealed, but instead appears as a hieroglyph of the lion. This is obviously a reference to Crowley, because subsequent to this we read the detailed description of the law that this new prophet brings, and this is the Law of Thelema with its main precept of do what thou wilt, excuse me, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, and its corollary, love is the law, love and the will. At this point, a maiden enters, who introduces herself with the words, "My name is the Star of the North." The allusion here is to a figure that is represented in the tarot under the name of High Priestess, with an alternative title of the Priestess of the Silver Star. On the Tree of Life, the corresponding path connects the highest Sephira, Keter, crown, with the central one, Tiferet, beauty. She hands a piece of writing to Khaled Khan, implying that what is being communicated stems from the highest spiritual sphere, from the crown of the Tree of Life. It is a document bearing a title, To Man, and it proclaims, I quote, the next step from the magical formula of Osiris to that of Horus. After this, the maiden departs. The final section of the Heart of the Master concerns the mystery of sin. The gist of this segment of the text is that the essence of Thelema lies in the discovery of one's purpose on earth, one's will, and in the execution of the same. The only sin is the restriction of one's own nature. The Law of Thelema, do what thou wilt, is announced as, quote, the first law ever given to man, which is a true law for all men in every place and time, end quote. Khaled Khan, now addressed as the child of the dawn of the Aeon, is praised for his understanding of the Law of Thelema, from which he also profited. For, I quote, the law is a just law. It demanded not the crooked knee of slavery and the bowed head of shame, end quote. Following the last words of the old instructor, the temple disappears and Khaled Khan finds himself in a desert place, strange and remote. it is hinted that he underwent further experiences at this place, but of which he cannot speak. I quote, for there is a beauty which had no fitter ornament than silence, end quote. The next section is the heart of the Master is the Thelemic apocalypse. The biblical scholar John J. Collins, in a seminal study on apocalypses published in 1979, provides a useful analysis and definition of this class of texts, taking advantage of the concept of a literary genre. The literary genre itself is defined as denoting, I quote, a group of written texts marked by distinctive recurring characteristics which constitute a recognizable and coherent type of writing, end quote. As regards the term apocalypse, meaning revelation in Greek, Collins emphasizes that its specific usage intended to refer to particular texts is a modern one. Moreover, not all texts that contain this word in their title are actual apocalypses, while the others clearly are without being titled as such. The upshot of this situation is that, I quote, an apocalypse is simply that which scholars can agree to call an apocalypse, end quote. I will capitalize on this liberty given to interpreters' agency and, as already indicated, apply the term apocalypse to Crowley's The Heart of the Master. My strategy is based on the supposition that the text displays, quote, distinctive characteristics which constitute a recognizable and coherent type of writing, quote, namely those of an apocalypse. The rest of this paper will be devoted to substantiating this claim. To start with, let me address the issue of the denominational porousness and the inclusive character of the concept of the apocalypse as a literary genre. While the term is most often associated with Christian eschatological ideas due to the influence of the New Testament book of Revelation, Collins emphasizes that the apocalyptic genre is in fact well established in Jewish, Christian, and Gnostic literature, and has at least some representatives in Greco-Roman, Persian, and the later Jewish rabbinic literature. Scholars have applied the term to conceptually similar textual accounts in many other religious and mythological traditions across the globe and over the span of historical periods, from ancient to contemporary. There is thus no a priori reason that would exclude the possibility of considering the Heart of the Master as an example of a 20th century apocalypse anchored in the spiritual tradition of Thelema as a new religious movement. In his analysis of the apocalyptic genre, Collins has extrapolated what he terms the master paradigm, which consists of two main elements: the framework of the revelation and its content. Both of these are further divided into the manner of revelation and its concluding elements as regards the framework, and into the temporal and spatial axis as regards the content. The temporal axis concerns historical and eschatological events, while the spatial axis deals with otherworldly beings and places. I will correlate the segments of the Heart of the Master with the elements of this master paradigm, but I will refrain from commenting on all possible aspects of convergence and will instead focus on those that I consider more important. Regarding the manner of the revelation, the first element to consider concerns the medium, which may be visual or auditory. In the Heart of the Master, both of these are present, appropriately titled the vision and the voice, which are the first two sections of the text. The visual and auditory media of witnessing the revelation are also essential to the third section of the text, the Temple of Truth. In part one, Khalid Khan has a vision of the Master accompanied by cherubic animals, who proclaims the Law of Thelema, followed by the appearance of 7 birds who describe and glorify the qualities of the Master. It is clear that both visual and auditory elements are present in this section of the text. The second section, the voice, consists of auditory medium only, where the silence effected by the mystical union experienced by Khaled Khan is translated into speech that describes the 10 joys, the 22 secret instructions, and the 4 virtues of the heart of the master. The Temple of Truth describes the vision in the course of which Khaled Khan enters into this secret place, where he undergoes initiation and receives teachings from his instructor. Crowley's text also contains additional elements relevant to the medium of revelation, discourse and otherworldly journey. Collins defines discourse as an, I quote, uninterrupted speech by the mediator, which takes place in the final section of the heart of the master, the otherworldly journey in the course of which the visionary travels through remote regions beyond the normally accessible world, is also described in the 3rd section of Crowley's text, where Khaled Khan entered into the Temple of Truth and beheld that vision and received this voice. There remain two more important aspects related to the manner of revelation: the otherworldly mediator who communicates the content and the human recipient. Collins notes that the former is most often an angel, or in some Christian texts, Christ. In the heart of the master, there are 2 such otherworldly mediators: the unnamed 120-year-old instructor and the maiden, the star of the north. I already suggested that the instructor shares archetypal resemblance to the legendary Christian Rosenkreuz, and if my proposal that the maiden represents the figure, otherwise depicted as the high priestess in the tarot, is correct, it is notable that in Crowley's system she is, I quote, symbolic of the thought, or rather of the intelligible radiance of the holy guardian angel. So angel again. As regards the human recipients of the revelation, it is interesting that Collins indicates pseudonymity as their characteristic feature. The recipient is usually identified as a venerable figure from the past. In the heart of the master, the narrator and the recipient of the revelation is Khaled Khan, not Aleister Crowley. In his introduction to the 1973 reissue of the book, the British occultist and one-time secretary to Aleister Crowley, Kenneth Grant, suggests that Khaled Khan was a great warrior who delivered the Arabs from the stranglehold of Christianity at the Battle of Damascus. In other words, a venerable figure from the past, according to Collins. When it comes to the content of the revelation, Collins's master paradigm distinguishes between temporal and spatial axes. In the case of temporal axis, the most important element of convergence between the contents of the heart of the master and this aspect of the paradigm concern the views of history, the world, and the cosmic transformation, where the whole world is renewed. In Crowley's text, the history of the world is interpreted as being overseen and influenced by the Great White Brotherhood, who sends emissaries to help the progress of humanity at the intervals of 2,000 years in case of major changes. The structure of the world and its metaphysical foundations are thoroughly explained in the part 2 of the text, The Voice, which is by and large based on the occultist kabbalistic speculations. The cosmic transformation is addressed narratively towards the end of the part 1 of the Heart of the Master, and by implication throughout the text as a whole. The reader will recall the already quoted statement where the Master proclaims the new word, Thelema, which results in the following event, quote, "Then is all heaven aflame with a great blast of trumpets, and the whole world is alight with one flash, that sundered every spirit that liveth, branding this sign upon them, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," end quote. Similarly, and by inference, the proclamation from the manifesto that the maiden shows to Khaled Khan in part 3, where it is stated that Master Aeon took upon himself his office so that mankind may take the next step from the magical formula of Osiris to that of Horus, also suggests the transformation of the whole world, the mankind. In this case, symbolized by the introduction of the new magical formula that is supposed to be dominant throughout an eon here understood as a span of 2,000 years. As regards the spatial axis of the master paradigm, the heart of the master displays two of its constitutive elements, otherworldly regions and otherworldly beings. The otherworldly region described in Crowley's text is the temple of truth, where Khalid Khan receives teachings related to the initiatic understanding of the history of the world, dominated by the influence of the emissaries of the Great White Brotherhood, and where the major points of the doctrine of Thelema are explained to him by his aged instructor and the celestial maiden. And while it may be possible to argue that the temple is simply a place difficult to access, but not necessarily otherworldly, the closing paragraph of the text leaves no room for such a suspicion, indicating clearly that what was witnessed by Khalid Khan took place in a vision. Quote, "With that word, the walls of the little chamber in the temple upon the mountaintop fell suddenly away from about me, and I found myself alone in a desert place, strange and remote," end quote. Incidentally, this also corresponds to the final element in Collins's master paradigm, the narrative conclusion, in itself an aspect of the framework of the revelation, and which he describes as the awakening or return to earth of the recipient, the departure of the revealer, or the consequent action of the recipients. At the conclusion of his narrative, after Khalid Khan finds himself in the desert, he hints at further experiences that he undergoes there, but of which he must remain silent. And the final part of my essay is called the conclusions. It seems conclusive based on the convergence of a number of formal elements between Collins's master paradigm and the heart of the master, that this narrative and expository account of a mystical, visual, and auditory experience can be identified as an apocalypse. This thematic convergence is also observable when we consider Collins's formal definition of the apocalyptic genre, which he memorably put as, I quote, "a genre of revelatory literature with a narrative framework in which a revelation is mediated by an otherworldly being to a human recipient, disclosing a transcendent reality which is both temporal insofar as it envisages eschatological salvation, and spatial insofar as it involves another supernatural world," end quote. In the heart of the master, Khalid Khan is given teachings from two otherworldly mediators who disclose to him the historical succession of global esoteric Prisky theology, who are sent as the emissaries of the Great White Brotherhood, whose existence is above the abyss, otherworldly. There is, however, one element in Crowley's text that does not fully correspond to Collins's master paradigm and definition of the apocalyptic genre. This concerns the motive of eschatological salvation. In his paradigm, Collins dissects this motive into several constitutive elements, proposing that this may involve cosmic transformation, personal salvation, resurrection, or other forms of afterlife. The motive of cosmic transformation has already been addressed, and here the convergence obtains. But the concept of salvation as such, deeply embedded in traditional religions, where the notion of a personal savior is paramount, is by and large absent in Thelema. The same remark applies to the idea of resurrection. In the heart of the master, Khalid Khan's instructor explicitly connects this idea to the worldview characteristic of the old Aeon of Osiris, when, I quote, "men worshipped man as they worshipped woman in the Aeon of Isis, thinking him subject to death and his victory dependent upon resurrection," end quote. The new Aeon, symbolized by the god Horus, is the Aeon of the crowned and conquering child, who dies not, nor is reborn, but goes radiant ever upon his way. That was a quote. The implication is that the salvation is not dependent on the external savior, but on the recognition of one's own inner divinity, formally designated as one's will. The final parting words that the instructor delivers to Khalid Khan encourage him that, I quote, "Shouldst thou speak even to the God of gods, stand thou erect, that thou mayst be one with him by love, as he most surely willeth," end quote. Formal aspects and characteristic attributes of the apocalyptic genre accomplish several important tasks and are as such of great importance to Crowley as to other authors writing and expounding their alleged extraordinary experiences in this vein. The Heart of the Master suggests vividly, through its narrative, that Thelema is simultaneously a new way of being in the world, an ideology of the new Aeon, a break from the previous ages, telescoped into concepts of matriarchy and patriarchy, and that it represents a continuation and a culmination of the esoteric wisdom enacted by the global actors in the process encompassing the millennia of human history. The text also proposes that Thelema is not an invention of a person, Aleister Crowley, but that it has transcendental point of origin, and that its prophet, Master Aeon, is an emissary of the Great White Brotherhood. The text also provides an initiated view of the constitutive elements of the universe, based on the occultist kabbalistic arrangements, among which the symbolic diagram of the Tree of Life is most important. Crowley argues that, I quote, "Every new Aeon demands a new system of classification of the universe," end quote. And in the Heart of the Master, the system characteristic of the Aeon of Horus is described in the second part of the text, the voice. The final section of the text, the mystery of sin, similarly touches upon an issue indicated by its title, sin, that was of great importance to Christianity, from which Thelema most robustly gestures away, but to which it gives an original spin. The sin is a refusal to exercise one's true will based on the ignorance of the same. It is a restriction in oneself and a blasphemy against the self. That was a quote. The most important suggestion is that the acceptance of the law of Thelema does not imply an embrace of an ideological or a metaphysical construct, but is an objective fact giving absolute agency to each and every individual. Quote, "In a word, he who accepts not the law of Thelema is divided against himself. That is, he is insane, and the upshot will be the ruin of the unity of his Godhead," end quote. In his essay on the Apocalypse of Islam, Norman O. Brown astutely observes that, I quote, "To start a new civilization is not to introduce some new refinements in higher culture, but to change the imagination of the masses," end quote. To what degree is the imagination of the masses influenced by apocalyptic and esoteric narratives and ideas is an open question, as is the whole issue of the new Aeon, of which Aleister Crowley considered himself the prophet. These considerations transcend the confines and objectives of the present writing. Crowley's influence on the contemporary esotericism was and remains substantial, but Thelema as a new religious movement remains a chosen path to a tiny minority of adherents. In this context, it is interesting to observe that in his swan song, The Book of Thought, published during the genuinely apocalyptic period of World War II in 1944, Crowley concludes the description of one of the most important major arcana, the Aeon, on a dual note of pessimistic prophecy and hope. Discussing the social and political upheavals characteristic of the periods when the epochs or eons change, he comments, I quote, "It is very instructive to compare the events of the 500 years preceding and following the crisis of approximately 2,000 years ago with those of similar periods centered in 1904, the year of the reception of the Book of the Law, of the old era. It is a thought far from comforting to the present generation that 500 years of dark ages are likely to be upon us. But If the analogy holds, that is the case. Fortunately, today we have brighter torches and more torch bearers, end quote. Only time will tell whether in this instance, Crowley's assessment of the state of things was genuinely prophetic, and whether the torch bearers with brighter torches will truly increase in their numbers. Thank you.